The following stunts are for entertainment purposes only. Attempts to duplicate them will result in serious injury, death, ridicule, embarrassment, and severe feelings of hopelessness. Enjoy the show! Hi folks. Today, on this beautiful Saturday morning, I need to change the slave cylinder on my Ford Ranger pickup. On most of the vehicles that I've dealt with in the past, the hydraulic slave cylinder for the clutch is a little doohickey that looks like this. Mounts on the side of the transmission with 2 bolts. If you need to replace it, unhook the line, take the 2 bolts out, and replace it. No problem. 5-minute job, and you're back on the road. Unfortunately, because Ford engineers have their head in places that probably shouldn't be, this is what the slave cylinder looks like on my Ford Ranger. This is a concentric slave cylinder that mounts around the transmission input shaft, which means, unfortunately, to replace this little marvel, you need to pull the transmission. This is a terrible idea for 2 reasons. One, why should you have to remove a transmission to replace a part that does fail with some frequency? And 2, if you look at how large this piston area is for the slave cylinder, there has to be a seal around this whole circumference to keep the brake fluid, or clutch fluid in this case, in. And this is very high pressure, so there's a big seal around this whole thing that could fail. On this one, just a little bitty seal right here, a little O-ring, a lot less surface area to fail. So if I could, I would dump this whole idea into a lake of boiling brake fluid, but I can't, so instead I just need to deal with it and replace the slave cylinder. It so happens I just did this job about a year ago. The original slave cylinder failed and I bought a replacement piece from O'Reilly Auto Parts. It only lasted about a year and now it's leaking again. I went into O'Reilly's and they were cheerful. They were happy to tell me that that part had a lifetime warranty, so I got this new one for free. And that really made me think about lifetime warranties. When you think about lifetime warranties, you think, oh yeah, extra high quality, I'll pay the few bucks extra. Wrong. I don't think that's the case. I think they make the parts extra cheap just so they can afford to give you 20 replacements if they need to. That's my theory on warranties. So I've just about got the transmission out of the truck, and if you want a detailed explanation of that procedure, you can check out this video right here. Otherwise, let's get to it. So here we are under the truck. This is definitely not one of Jake's favorite places. I've removed the starter, the cross member, and all of the electrical and hydraulic fittings from the transmission, as well as most of the transmission to engine mounting bolts. And I have the transmission propped up right now by this floor jack. But what I'm going to do now is take out the last couple of bolts that hold the transmission to the engine up here, and then kind of slide this transmission back and kind of ease it down with my knees. I got a long extension here that I can take this last bolt out with. I want to keep steady pressure under this thing at all times, because even though it's heavy, it's a lot less heavy right now than it would be if it started to fall. I'd rather just lower this thing down easily than have it fall on my big toe. Okay, so all the bolts are loose. Oh, let's say a quick prayer. Uh-oh. Okay, I still got a exhaust mounting point here. I gotta remove this thing. Stand by. The suspense is killing me. Okay, I got that pesky exhaust mount out of the way. And let's resume.
lower my jack. Feels like I'm giving birth to something here. Back up a little more. Okay, she's down. Okay, we'll get that jack out of under there. Get me out from under there. All right. So now we can get to that slave cylinder.
So there's the slave cylinder that I need to replace, and it's all wet with brake fluid because it's leaking. It's really easy to get to after you take off the transmission. So I'll just take out these bolts here and here and pop that new one right into place. So here we are back in the shop, and I can get a closer look at the damage. You can see all the mess that's here on the bottom of this slave cylinder. And here's what I was talking about earlier. There has to be a seal that can hold back all that high pressure brake fluid around this whole area right here. And of course, the larger area that has to be sealed, the greater chances that that seal can fail. So the chances weren't on my side with this part. I've also noticed that the throwout bearing is embarrassingly loose, and this is and noisy too. Listen to that. And this is not an old part. I bought this about a year ago. So junk, just junk. On the plus side, the new part, which is the exchange that they gave me for this one, looks to be a little bit better. This bearing, of course, now feels much smoother because it's new. They've also put a dust jacket around this part, so maybe that'll keep some of the junk out from getting into the seal. The base is also metal instead of molded plastic, so I'll install this baby and see if it can't last more than a year. And there's the new and hopefully improved clutch slave cylinder installed and ready for action. Now the big question, can we get this transmission back where it belongs without incident? Now, if you don't already know, the goal of this procedure is to place the transmission input shaft into this hole right here. It needs to go in straight, and because the shaft is splined, I may need to wiggle jiggle the transmission a little bit as I try to mate it to the engine. So it's a little bit of trial and error, a little bit of luck, and hopefully my muscles don't give out before everything is where it should be. So there's the promised land right there. That's what we're aiming for. Okay, now that it's finally where it belongs, I reached my extension up here to try to get a bolt started in it because I don't want it coming back out, which it wants to do. Okay, now that it's not going to fall down on me, I've got a pointer that I didn't think about before. To ensure that the transmission is at the right angle so that that shaft can easily go into the motor, you can use this exhaust mounting bracket kind of as a reference. If you hold it kind of where it goes on the transmission, you'll be able to see where that height is in relation to this arm that it slides onto, because that's the height that it needs to be at. So you kind of adjust where the transmission is that way. So now I'm going to try to get a bolt started on the top of the bell housing now that I have one on the bottom, and then cinch this transmission back up to the block. I've got my helper working with me today. Meow. Okay, I've got a couple of the bolts on the top of the transmission started, and one thing I need to remember as I remarry this engine and transmission is that the gap between the engine and transmission right here needs to stay the same around the whole circumference of the bell housing. So I need to watch that as I pull these two parts together again, I have the same gap here as I do on the driver's side and as I do on the top and bottom of the transmission. So that's just something to watch out for. And also, as I'm tightening these bolts down, it's all right to kind of pinch the engine and transmission together with the force of tightening of the bolts, but if you encounter any kind of resistance while doing that, you better find out what's going on, because this transmission should just slide right up against the engine without any force. The bolts are just there to hold it. So don't use the bolts as a 2-ton puller to try to pull these two together. It won't work and you'll break something likely. I've reinstalled all of the transmission to engine mounting bolts. The lower ones I was able to access from underneath, and naturally the top ones I was able to remove and install from above. The next thing I'm going to do is reinstall this exhaust pipe mounting bracket. Bracket installed. Next we'll throw up this cross member. Cross member installed, which means now I can remove the jack. Now let's see if I can put the starter back where it belongs. It's always important to disconnect the battery before messing with the starter, unless you want to see a lot of sparks fly. So I'll get a bolt started in it now. I'm holding it with both hands because if this thing fell, it would definitely chip a tooth. So there's one bolt in there. 3 bolts hold this onto the transmission. Why is it the wrench I need is always just out of reach? Ah. The starter is on with the electrical connected. Next I'm going to tackle the drive shaft. So we'll just slide the front end in like this. And bolt the back to the rear end. Don't let these bolts intimidate you. They're just a 12mm 12-point socket. You probably got 2 or 3 of them in your toolbox. Drive shaft is now installed. The word drive shaft reminds me of what was once my favorite television show, Lost. It was my favorite television show until I got to the series finale and realized there was no way they were going to explain anything. Just fancy visuals with no substance. That was a letdown. That was a letdown, friends. Next we need to replace the hydraulic line. Lastly, we need to bleed any air that's in the slave cylinder. To do this, I'll crack open this bleed nipple. I'm just going to let it run for a little while. And I'll go up top to make sure my reservoir doesn't empty out. Next, we need to fill this bad boy up with transmission oil. Contrary to reason, it takes automatic transmission fluid. I don't have any here at the house, so I need to go into town to get some, but I'll be back momentarily. I just got back from Walmart with some automatic transmission fluid. The capacity of this transmission is 2.8 quarts, but I had 1.5 quarts on hand, so I only had to buy 2 quarts, and I'll have a little bit left over. To keep things easy, I'm going to be pouring it in from the top But before I do that, I need to remove this fill plug right here and place a pan underneath. And I'll just start pouring the fluid in from the top, and when I hear it start dribbling out of that fill hole, I'll know when to cease fire. Plug out and pan underneath. Let's go back up top. Here's where it'd be nice to have two sets of eyes. I've got it pouring in from the top, and I'm keeping an eye on her at the bottom. Okay, I hear a dribble. That's full. Fill plug and drain plug are both installed. And next I'll just slip this gear shifter back into place. The shifter is in. Now I can install this plastic trim piece, which is pretty much devastated. Next we'll just pop on the cup holders. And my custom shift knob to finish things off. It's been documented that this gains 50 horsepower and 5/10 in the quarter mile. Vroom, vroom, vroom. Well, I suppose the last step is to see if it works. So you stay down here and I'll go push on the clutch pedal up there. What's that? It works? All right, I'll take your word for it. Thanks for watching.